Hello friends, welcome to Ecoholics YouTube channel. My name is Avinash Agarwal, and in this video I'll be discussing with you economics current affairs for 31st October 2024. Wishing you all a very happy Diwali and a very prosperous year going ahead. So let us start with our discussion. I have selected 3 articles from the Mint newspaper which I'll be discussing with you. First article speaks about the fiscal health trend of Indian states. So you must be aware, and if you are not aware, that's fine, I will teach you that whether it is government of India or whether it is government of states in India, fiscal deficit, revenue deficit is something that we want to keep under control. What is the meaning of these terms? Why do we want to keep them under control? We'll be discussing all of this in the first article. Second article, it speaks about the challenges in formalizing the informal sector firms in India. So there are a lot of informal sector enterprises. How do you formalize them? What are the challenges? And how can accurate data collection help in shaping effective policies for formal enterprises is the second question that I will help you answering in. Third question is discuss the current trends in India's macroeconomic indicators, implications for economic stability and growth. Include aspects of inflation, trade deficit, monetary policy, fiscal policy and employment. So basically the third article is a very broad based and a very wide spectrum article in the sense that what's really happening across a variety of different domains of economy. It gives you a snapshot, so it will be very helpful. So all these 3 articles are helpful in their own ways. So let us start with the first article. Let us speak about the fiscal deficit aspect first for the states. Now let me explain the meaning of these broad terms to you. What does the term fiscal deficit etc. mean, so that you will have a better understanding of what we are discussing. Okay, so please understand that if you look at the total revenue of the government, any government in India, government of India or state, if you look at the total revenue, right, so they have 2 sources of revenue, right, 2 broad sources of revenue. They can have, let us say, a capital revenue, or they can have, let us say, they can have a capital receipt, or they can have a revenue receipt. Okay, so for total receipt you can have receipts coming in either via capital receipts or revenue receipts. Very briefly speaking, what are the kinds of revenue receipts that a states may get, that a government may get? So all kind of taxes, whether direct taxes or indirect taxes, all kinds of taxes are a part of revenue receipt. All the profits from PSUs, dividends from PSUs is a part of revenue receipts. All the interest earned from loans given is a part of revenue receipts. All the grants received from government of India as well as international grants is a part of revenue receipts. All the aids, all the help that you get is a part of revenue receipts, right? So typically these are your major sources of revenue receipts, right? As well as fines and fees, as well as fines and fees. So taxes, profit, interest, grants, aid, fines and fees, these are part of revenue receipts. What are capital receipts? Capital receipts is something that you get when you sell your assets. Okay, so you may be selling land, or you may be selling your enterprises, or you may be selling your shares in your public sector undertakings. Whatever the case may be, you're selling some kind of an asset. Money that gets generated from this process is called capital receipts, right? So one famous way of generating capital receipts in India is disinvestment. Okay, now please understand this very carefully, right? Please understand this very carefully, that this total receipts should be helpful so far as our total expenditure is concerned, meaning that our total expenditure can also be divided into 2 buckets, that is capital expenditure and revenue expenditure, right? What is revenue expenditure? Very broadly speaking, revenue expenditure is basically expenditure on salary of employees, pension of past employees, subsidies for the vulnerable section of the society, right? Whether it is scholarship, etc., etc. Any kind of subsidy that you can imagine, food subsidy, fertilizer subsidy, any kind of subsidy that is being provided, right? That is a part of revenue expenditure of the government of India. Expenditure on law, judiciary, administration, all of this is revenue expenditure. Okay, what is capital expenditure? Capital expenditure, very broadly speaking, is expenditure on purchasing land, building, factory, equipment, machinery, furnitures and fixtures, anything which has a long-term value, right? That is capital expenditure. So typically capital expenditure, so whenever government of any state or any government of India is, supporting the infrastructure sector, they are spending big on the infrastructure sector, that is capital expenditure, right? Whenever they are creating, let us say, new PSUs, if they are creating new PSUs, that would also classify as a capital expenditure, right? But primarily right now in India, capital expenditure over infrastructure is very, very important, because if you build out the right infrastructure, then you create potential for growth. And that potential for growth basically means that you will increase the productive capacity of your area. If you increase the productive capacity of your area, more production can take place possibly in the future going ahead. And that more production can translate into better growth, more employment prospects, and so on and so forth. So capital expenditure is paramount. Capital expenditure is very, very important. Be it government of India, government of states, capital expenditure is very, very important. Revenue expenditure is committed expenditure in the sense that you cannot, interest payment is also a part of revenue expenditure. You cannot not pay salaries, you cannot not pay pension, you cannot not give subsidies, you cannot not give interests, because this is committed. Once you have started this expenditure, you have to do this, honor this expenditure. So this is committed expenditure. It is considered to be not productive in the sense that capital expenditure, it leads to asset creation, right? But revenue expenditure, it doesn't lead to asset creation. Revenue expenditure is more like your day-to-day administrative kind of an expenditure. It helps you in keeping your lights and fans on in government offices, is how I always say about revenue expenditure. It is day-to-day kind of expenditure, right? So any government which wants to protect future growth prospects, which wants to increase the potential growth going ahead, will prioritize capital expenditure very well. Revenue expenditure is something that you can't avoid. You have to undertake it, but you have to keep it under control. Now let us take one step ahead. See, ideally speaking, what you have to be able to do is that you have to be able to take this total receipts and match it with total expenditure. But many a times what happens is that total expenditure is greater than total receipts. Many a times this happens. So as a result of which you need to borrow, right? So that borrowing is essentially referred to as your fiscal deficit. What is fiscal deficit? It indicates the borrowing requirement of the government. I'm not going into the technical definition of fiscal deficit as of now. I can do that, but I don't want to overcomplicate your life immediately. So very broadly, very generally speaking, borrowing requirement of any government is essentially referred to as fiscal deficit, right? Fiscal deficit can be broken down in the sense that you can see what is the difference between revenue expenditure and revenue receipt, and this gives you a sense of revenue deficit, right? So revenue deficit is one component of fiscal deficit. Similarly, again, I'm generalizing way too much now. So I know that very specifically speaking, things can be a little different. Capital expenditure minus capital receipts would probably give you a sense of how much you need to borrow to fund your capital expenditure. But let's completely leave this out of the discussion. Let's just say that this is extremely harmful. This is extremely unproductive. That if you are borrowing to spend on revenue expenditure, if you are borrowing to cover your revenue expenditure, which is non-productive expenditure, then that's just a waste of time. That's just not acceptable. So revenue deficit has to be as close as zero as possible in India, right? So keep that in mind. And secondly, this revenue deficit has to be within control. It has to be on the downward declining path. That is something that we'll be discussing. So with this basic understanding in place, I believe that we can start our discussion for the first article. See, typically we discuss all of these things as a part of our paid course on Ecoholics, but we want you to understand everything as beautifully as possible. Hence, I am taking the effort to explain this entire theoretical construct to you. It's not a complete discussion, but if you have even 15% understanding of these concepts by this particular effort of mine, probably you will have a 50% understanding of these concepts, right? If there is any doubt, you can feel free to ask. I will answer your doubts. Okay. Now moving ahead. Okay. So we are going to discuss the fiscal health of the states. What do I mean by fiscal health of the states? I am going to discuss exactly what's happening to states' fiscal deficits, their revenue deficits, right? Are they able to, take care of their expenditure through their receipts? Yes or no? We are going to be discussing that. Okay. So this is going to be a slow burn discussion, right? I'm going to take my own sweet time to discuss this article because it's an important article, right? So, see, there was a lot of synchronous improvement that was happening. What do I mean by synchronous improvement? Meaning the center was also improving its financial health and states were also improving their financial health, right? Now, what has happened is that this synchronous improvement is not happening anymore in the sense that the center continues to be on a fiscal path, on a fiscal discipline path, meaning that they are managing their finances in a very disciplined and a responsible manner. But there are states which are struggling to cope up with the requirements of fiscal discipline. They are falling short of their promises, right? So what has happened is that a lot of states, they are having a sizable fiscal deficit, means a sizable borrowing requirement, right? So they are now aggressively cutting back on expenditure. Aggressively cutting back on expenditure is fantastic. But if I tell you I'm aggressively cutting back on capital expenditure, it's not fantastic anymore. And I cannot aggressively cut back on revenue expenditure because it is committed expenditure. So I am stuck between a rock and a hard place. I will repeat myself only once. That if I'm cutting back on capital expenditure, it's not desirable. It's harmful for the future. If any government in anywhere in India is cutting back on capital expenditure, is not doing itself a favor, right? Now let's discuss in some more detail. Let's put some numbers, right? Let's put center's number on the table first. So center, it has stayed on the fiscal consolidation path, right? So fiscal deficit of the central government was 9.2% in 2021. There is an entire story behind why this number became 9.2%, but I will not get into that story immediately now because my discussion will be going in a different direction then. So let's just look at the numbers. So center had a fiscal deficit of 9.2% in 2021. Okay. They brought it down to 5.6% by 23-24, right? And they have budgeted a number of 5.9%, right? As compared to the target of 5.9%. So the target was 5.9 and they were able to overachieve and achieve 5.6%. Right, this is about the 23-24, that is the last financial year. Currently we are in 24-25, right? Currently we are in 24-25. So last financial year, government of India was able to reduce its borrowing requirement to 5.6% of GDP as compared to the target of 5.9% of GDP, meaning they had said that they will borrow more, but they ended up borrowing less. So why did they ended up borrowing less than what they had initially planned for? Because of strong tax revenue, because of large dividend from the Reserve Bank of India, because of restrained revenue expenditure, right? So this is called fiscal consolidation 101, right? To bring about fiscal consolidation, what you need to do is that you need to augment your receipts and you need to keep a lid on your expenditure. You need to keep your expenditure under control. So you see, this is a point of receipt that tax revenue was buoyant. This is a point of receipt that you got a decent dividend from the Reserve Bank of India and you kept your expenditure under control. This is your expenditure wala point, right? Combined together, you see that you were able to achieve fiscal consolidation. This is what you need to appreciate about Government of India's recent fiscal health. If they ask you anything about Government of India's fiscal policy, this is the bare minimum. This is the barest minimum that you have to mention about what is happening in the current context, right? So I hope that this is very clear to all of you. If there is any doubt, you can ask me in the live stream itself. I'll be more than willing to answer your doubts in the live stream itself, right? I can see your live chats on my screen. So if anybody wants to ask anything, please ask. States, looking at states, right? So we will be looking at the aggregate gross fiscal deficit, right? So states का aggregate gross fiscal deficit that declined from 4.1% to 2.8%. Okay. Revenue expenditure, it normalized in the sense that during the pandemic, states had to deal with a lot of healthcare related additional expenditure. So that kind of, went away as COVID went away. So revenue expenditure normalized and revenue collection improved because economy came back on track. We came out of lockdown, etc. Right? But this is about 2022-23. Okay. 23-24 and now के अंदर you see that financials of several states, they have weakened. How is it that they have weakened? Right? that there are differences in the budget estimates and the revised estimates of key parameters in the last financial year. Now let me explain these two terms to you, budget estimates and revised estimates, in a very layman term. Let's say that today is a day of, let's say, holiday, and you are an aspirant and you decide that you will make most productive utilization of this day in terms of academics and studies. So you earmark 8 hours of study up till 6 p.m. so that after 6 p.m. you can participate in festivities. But at 6 p.m. when you do a stock taking, you realize that instead of achieving the target of 8 hours, you have achieved a target, or you have achieved only 6 hours. So what is it that you had budgeted? You had budgeted 8 hours. What did you achieve? 6 hours. So your revised is less than your budgeted and the numbers are not looking good. Same thing happens with states or with governments, that they have budgetary revenue estimates that we will earn X lakh crore in the form of budgetary estimates, but we end up earning only Y lakh crore, right? And Y is less than X, right? So when Y is less than X, that means that this X minus Y, the extra that you need to borrow, this is something which is a surprise for everybody. So maybe you had massaged this number, maybe this number was never true and honest to start with, but you had made this number appear in the budgets so that you look good on day zero, and ultimately you end up borrowing and nobody will go and check what's happening after, the event has occurred, right? So you can push your borrowing under the radar. You can push your borrowing away from the gaze of the analysts on day one, right? So many a times governments in India, not just any particular state government or government of India, in general, governments of India, oftentimes they fudge their numbers. The budgetary estimates are many a times off the mark. Many a times they are deliberately off the mark. Many a times they are off the mark. It's a genuine mistake in estimation, whatever the case may be. But many a times your revised estimates don't match up to your budget estimates. That's what the problem is sometimes, right? Moving ahead, right? So if you look at the fiscal deficit of 9 out of 18 non-special category states. So these non-special category states are non-hilly states. So we are removing hilly states, forested states, northeastern states, etc., border states from our discussion. We are looking at 18 non-special category states, meaning general states, right? So 9 out of 18, they overshot their budget targets, right? Now this is getting into nitty-gritty. Okay, please bear with me. You don't need to remember everything. I'll tell you what you need to remember, but please bear with me, because without discussing, there will be meaningless point over here, right? So of these 9 states, right, that overshot their budget targets, revenue of 4 was below target. So revenue being below target is a problem. Expenditure of 5 exceeded the target. So expenditure management is a problem. So you see that there can be only two problems. A, revenue being lower than expected. B, expenditure being higher than expected. These are the only two possibilities. There is no other possibility. And both these possibilities are a reality in either 4 states or 5 states, right? Of the remaining, on the remaining 9 states, so 9 out of 18 are clearly in the problem. So 9 के अंदर से 4 के पास जो है, 4 had revenue issues, 5 had expenditure issues. Okay, let's just put the score over here. 9 states out of 18, right? We are talking about 9 states out of 18. 4 had revenue being less than what it should be, and 5 had expenditure more than what it should be. Now remaining 9, 5 cut their expenditure in the face of lower revenue to contain their fiscal deficit, right? So 5, they lowered their expenditure. They lowered their expenditure to contain their fiscal deficit. Which kind of expenditure they would have cut? Most likely capital expenditure, which is deeply problematic. You should not cut capital expenditure, right? And 4 states, only 4 out of 18, they were able to generate revenue that was not less than what they had budgeted to meet their fiscal deficit target. So 4 के अंदर everything is fine. Whatever their target was, they have achieved that target, right? And whatever they had said that they will borrow, they have borrowed only that much, nothing more. That is Goa, Madhya Pradesh, Odisha and Rajasthan, right? If you compare this performance of, this is all about 23-24. This is all about 23-24. If you compare this 23-24 ka performance, right, with 22-23 ka performance. So 15 out of 18 state, they reported a higher fiscal deficit in the last fiscal year, right? So meaning that 22-23 was a much better year. By 23-24, this is 23-24 ka performance again. They reported a much higher fiscal deficit or a higher fiscal deficit, meaning your borrowing requirement has gone up. So this is the most latest current affair ka particular pointer that you have to note down, right? What are the factors responsible? Revenue expenditure has grown faster than revenue receipts. That's problem number one. Your expenditure is out of control. So states, they have gone from revenue surplus to being revenue deficit. So earlier you were revenue surplus, now you are revenue deficit. Why? Social welfare expenditure, it is the fastest growing item at 41.9%. States are providing financial assistance to specific groups, women, elderly, etc., etc., to fulfill their election promises. Cash handouts, direct benefit transfer schemes, 1,500 rupees per month, Ladli Behna scheme across various states in India. Ka impact is clearly visible in the budgets and will be clearly visible in the budgets going ahead. States, they have stepped up their capital expenditure in 23-24, for which they have borrowed more, which is good, right? This is very good. This is very commendable for the states that have done this, right? Not all states have done it, only some have done it. So it grew 38% for these 18 states. That's a good thing, right? So of the 15 that saw their fiscal deficits worsen last fiscal year, capital expenditure was not only higher but broadly in line with budget estimates. So this is very good that states are not relenting on capital expenditure. So revenue expenditure has overshot because of subsidies. Staying focused on capital expenditure is good, but because they did not compromise on capital expenditure, they did not compromise on revenue expenditure, you see that their borrowing requirement has gone up, right? Now there is a state-wise analysis that is done over here. Okay. Now what is the conclusion? What lies ahead for the states? Okay. So states, they have budgeted a reduction in their fiscal deficit, right? The problem is that we have slow economic growth and weaker than budgeted tax revenue. If this happens, then states will have to borrow more, right? There is a decline in grant in aid from the central government, right? Central government gives a lot of grants for conditional projects. You get money for drinking water, rainwater harvesting, sanitation. If you do this, you'll get money. If you don't do this, you don't get that money, right? So states are budgeting a declining grant in aid. So how will states improve their own tax revenue? How will they contain their populist schemes? This is what we need to see and discuss. And if the capital expenditure declines because of the fiscal deficit constraints, then that's a problem, right? So I intended to discuss a lot of articles, but today I'm discussing only one article. This is my one article that I've discussed with you. Please try to answer this question. Balance two articles we will discuss tomorrow, right? This will become a very heavy discussion if I discuss the remaining two articles, both for you as well as for me. So we'll bring this discussion to an end over here. I'm recuperating from a very bad health. So please allow me to end this lecture over here. We'll continue tomorrow. Wish you a very happy Diwali. And please read this article. I'll be sharing it as soon as possible. Thank you so much. All the best and Jai Hind to all of you.